Welcome to you all here. We started these forums with high expectations, and they've got better and better every year since. Now, it's customary, and we started this by accident, but it's now an established way of doing this, that we always start with industrialists, those people at the cutting edge of companies confronting the sorts of changes in the market that John described. We've had Ben Burden, we've had Lord Brown, we've had Johannes Thijssen, and today we've got two leading figures in our industry who have the hard day-to-day job of working out what, if I can put it this way, what the hell to do about this world that's unfolding around us. Just to briefly introduce our two industrialists. We've got Magnus, who took over at Vattenfall in 2014, I think. I've followed Vattenfall since the 1980s in all its various formats. At those times, one was working out what was going to happen about the referendum on nuclear power in Sweden, which came long before others. But Vattenfall is pioneering new technologies, wind, etc. And Magnus will go first. We've got Alistair Phillips-Davies, who took over, I think, about 2013 at SSE, but has been there since the formation of the company through the merger at the end of the 1990s. Seems a long time ago now, but there was one huge merger wave at that stage which created much of the vertical structure we have today. And Alistair is steering through with a demerger of supply, amongst many other things on his agenda. So Alistair will go second. Each of our speakers will have about 20 minutes to include questions, and I will try to conclude this session within the hour. So without further ado, Magnus, thank you very much for joining us today. Look forward to what you have to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that kind introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to come here and speak to you. I'm in Vattenfall since 2014, as Dieter said, and it's been quite a change. We are now, and were also before, a Northern European energy company operating across the whole value chain. So my answer to this question was, yes, I believe that we will actually be part of the big value chain also for the future. I say that already from the beginning, and then you can pose questions to me, perhaps. But we are really changing. We have, as you know, gotten rid of the big lignite business that we had in Germany. We are concentrating on the future. We have decided for what we think is important, and that's our purpose. That's to power climate-smarter living with the aim to be fossil-free within our own production and to enable our customers to be fossil-free within one generation. So we are really taking the climate issue seriously, because I think that's sort of the overall overshadowing issue when it comes to the energy industry. Electricity industry, which I will come back to, but also that in combination with generation adequacy, so we can make sure that we have supply in sufficient amounts all the time while we are changing. The discussion is going on that. Everybody knows that. We have a lot of political issues going around in the world, and I think the climate issue is perhaps a little bit to the side. My take of the whole situation is that will come back big time. And we know that the European Union is now pressing a lot in energy efficiency, in CO2 reduction in terms of ETS, even though we haven't seen. We will see how that will really materialize. And then, of course, also pushing renewables. And I think all this is going in the right direction. But I think the political momentum to push this will come back. And we will see that in the individual countries as we go forward, because I still believe this issue is really on the top of everybody's agenda. Also, it's a day to show the best way to get attention is to say it's not official. So the logotype you see here is our new changed logotype in our company, reflecting a change we're going through. So don't tell anybody about this, that you have seen this logotype, right? I think that's, please, just let it stay in this room, whether it was Chatham rules or something. But we are really proud of that. Power climate smarter living. And it's really about time to get going. And we all know about this challenge that we have in front of us. We have to reduce CO2 emissions by 50% by 2030, another 50% by 2040, and another 50% by 2050, if in the world, if we're going to get this temperature target that we have put up. And everybody are engaging in that. If you look to Sweden, of course, just take that as an example. We are lucky in the sense that our energy system is CO2 free from the beginning. So in Sweden, we had to concentrate on other things to find solutions actually in the customer area rather than in the production area. And that leads me to the big issue or the big theme that I want to talk about. 2 steps. It's about electrification as a means to solve climate change. I think there is a huge opportunity there. I think this notion is now growing. And of course, you will only solve this over time if you also do it with a climate neutral energy production so that you don't add more CO2 in that end, then it wouldn't make a lot of sense. And we all know about transportation that was mentioned here at the beginning. That's going to change. I mean, that's going to go very, very rapidly, I believe, when it really comes. But so far, we haven't really seen it tick off. We have to realize this is a huge change for the car manufacturers, like a heart. You know, you take everything internal here and you change it and you're going to go back and live the next life. I think this is a real challenge they have. But of course, our part of the challenge is to build an infrastructure. And from my company side, we are clearly engaging in that. And I know a lot of other companies are doing that as well. And of course, what are the real business, opportunities here? There will be, but we can't. I don't think there is a clear definition of what the actual business model will look like, but it will be there for you to grab. The second part of this is the development in heat. That's not so much talked about, but we can see that if you take a country like Sweden, we have already changed a lot to heat pumps using electricity. I think that when we will have a next phase somewhere in the future, gas phase out, where you also see heat pumps coming in, and then you will have a lot of electrification issues there coming up. And the other side of that is, of course, district heating, where we as a company are quite big involved. And if we just look to our UK situation, just briefly mentioning that we have been investing about £8 billion in the UK market, or sorry, £3 billion in the last 10 years, mainly in renewables, but now we're also approaching UK in a different way. We are here with grid operations, small scale. We are here with heat business, with retail, and we also do B2B business. So we are seeing UK as a market where we can enter into the future and where we will bring with us also the idea of electrification. The big issue for us that is new, you can say, is that Vattenfall as a company is always engaged with industry. And when we look at the electrification possibilities in industry, I would like just to share with you a few examples of what we're doing, and that we can see that will develop also as a good opportunity to find solutions to the climate change issue. And we are currently cooperating in Sweden with something called Hybrid. That's hydrogen breakthrough technology in steel making. And we do that in Sweden together with a steel maker in Sweden and a mining company in Sweden, where we are developing now a process which will replace the use of coal. Actually, coal is used to take out oxygen out of the iron ore, and then you will make steel out of that. You can also use hydrogen, so that the residual product is water rather than CO2. And so we have engaged in this. This has got a big resonance in the EU, in Swedish politics and everywhere, and we have now decided to build a first test plant in this development. So that's where, and of course, if we are successful, we're looking at the 15 to 20 terawatt hours of electricity used here to produce the hydrogen that you need, splitting water into hydrogen and oxygen. So really interesting. We are also working in a liquid transportation fuel, where you, of course, knowing Sweden a little bit, we have a lot of forest. And we want to use that forest for a good cause. Of course, we make paper and board products, but we also have a lot of residual material that we can use, and we can take that into, when you have this paper production process, you will take out lignite, and that lignite you can then turn into a good diesel fuel, actually, purely based on biomaterials if you use hydrogen. So again, that would be an opportunity where we are involving ourselves together with a Swedish refinery company called Preem. Then also cement, of course, huge CO2 emitter, we all know that. The physical part of that is the CO2 being released from the calcium, I don't know exactly the name in English, but you take out the CO2, of course, and that part of the process you can't really electrify, but you can electrify the heating part, which you need to do here, rather than using coal. And then you can take these CO2 emissions to actually do something. And that, we believe, is going to be one of the big next changes that you will see. And that is really interesting, is that you will look at fossil-free chemistry when you will take CO2, and you need the concentrated sources. Cement would be one of those concentrated CO2 sources, where you can then add hydrogen, and you can do all sorts of different things, sort of reconstructing the old fossil process the other way. And actually produce plastics, lots of different materials. And of course, then you would actually absorb CO2 from the atmosphere. And as such, I think, perhaps in the far future, but definitely technically possible, if it's going to be competitive enough. Of course, there is still, that jury is out on that, but we believe the development here will go rapidly. So we think there is a lot to do in electrification, in transportation, in heat, but also in industry. And we are now engaging ourselves with industries in other countries, not only in Sweden. We can see the chemical industry, which is a huge industry in Germany, for instance, really now taking a view where they can see electrification as part of their change towards a climate-smart solution for their production. And of course, we as a company want to be there. Our role in the process would be to, supply the electricity, make sure that we have everything that's needed there. We would do the split of the water into hydrogen and oxygen, and then we would store hydrogen, because storage of hydrogen is a big issue. Really complicated matter, and something that we can build a business on. So the other part of this discussion is, of course, we need the renewables if we're going to make this happen. And it's obviously clear that the previous speaker was talking about here. We can see the development very clearly. Just this picture showing the wind power. This is now offshore wind power, and where I remember that, I think it was 2 years ago, I was actually asked, because there was a challenge out of the previously Dong, now Ørsted, you all know this Danish company being very successful in offshore wind. They were challenging the whole industry by saying that we will accomplish a 35% cost reduction in 2 years. And we said, of course, we will do that. I think the cost reduction has now come to something like 55–60%. And it has really changed. And you can see the reasons for why it has changed. You can see in this picture, bigger turbines, bigger parks. We are clustering it in a different way. We're developing together with the suppliers of the equipment. We know suddenly how we are going to form those parks to make efficient use of the wind. So really all this is taking costs down. And this is not, now I think we have seen the steepest downturn probably, but we will continue to see this coming down. And what the important thing here is, of course, that we make actually offshore a competitive and viable option for big size production. It's not really decentral, it's a centralized thing, because we have, in parts of our wind parks, we have only 400 hours of zero production. So it comes even close to be called baseload, you can say. So the development here, I think, is a great opportunity for governments around that, for the whole industry to take part of where there is a new renewable source actually available at competitive levels, which we can then use. So, subsidy future is within reach. We saw that also when it comes to solar. We know that the cheapest form in Europe, I mean, you can see northern part of Europe, solar will be there, but wind onshore is probably the cheapest. We have now some examples in Sweden where we are clearly below 30 euros a megawatt hour for onshore wind. So really that is becoming very competitive. The whole problem, of course, is how are you going to bring those to the market? How are you going to do you want to take a full merchant risk on this development? And I think this is the question now, and sort of the essence of the discussion. We can see electrification as a possibility going forward. We know that renewables are coming down now in terms of costs in being really, really competitive. But how can we make this shift now really going? We have had so far support from governments. I think we will need to continue to have stabilizing systems like you have in the UK, the CFD system. We would ideally also have that also on onshore wind, in the sense that if there are locally accepted projects, they should be eligible for a CFD auction. That would make some sense to me, because it's still the cheapest way that you would actually get your consumers there in a good way when it comes to applying or getting low-cost energy. But the big issue here is the changeover. How are we going to do this now? And as you know, also this morning, yesterday we were awarded with the first offshore a subsidy-free wind park. We will be the first ones to build that one. And we are quite sure that part of the development we will have is a construction of cooperation with big industry, where we will need PPAs, where we will need the industry also to take on this challenge to be part of the development of the renewable side. And we can see that changing, really happening. And then we would need the industry, we would need the support of the government in terms of good and stable regulation. I still think there will be a need for a stabilizing subsidy. But over time, this will change, and slowly we will create this new system somewhere, in combination with storage development and all these things that will come along. But the development here is an appropriate risk sharing among the different bodies, and we are now entering into this phase. And I think this is a real challenge, but also a very interesting business opportunity. And as a company, we are not afraid to take merchant risk, because we have quite a big exposure on merchant risk in our company. Today, we know how to handle it. But if we want this to drive the development of renewables, we really need this big cooperation going. So I would like to leave you with electrification is key. Really think that's going to change the way we see and can handle climate change. We're in a hurry. This really needs to change. We need to address the issues that where we can push more renewables into the market on a more and more commercial basis. I think this is the message I want to send. And I think the opportunities are there for everybody to grab. Thank you so much.
And our next speaker in the session is Alistair Phillips-Davies. Alistair, to you.
Thank you very much, Dieter. I don't have as many colourful slides as Magnus, but hopefully I've got a few observations following the question posed to me by Dieter and John. It's about navigating the global energy sector. However, I work for SSE. We're principally based in the UK and Ireland, so I'll try and take this from our perspective, but obviously not try and be too blinkered. I think before I make these 5 observations, what I would say is there are probably 3 things to bear in mind. From our point of view, customers are absolutely paramount. Climate change is critical, and the energy system must be reliable. And in any conversation we have about energy, we've got to bear those 3 things in mind. So the first observation would be about the wall of money that is still coming into the sector. We've talked about global competition for investment, but actually with the number of funds that are out there now, with quantitative easing, relatively low interest rates, we clearly see huge amounts of money looking to invest across the piece in infrastructure assets. And this can be very good for society. We get lots of auctions, we get prices forced down, as Magnus has talked about, with the significant reduction in prices on offshore and onshore wind farms. However, it can lead to issues around transparency. Some of these funds, there are concerns about executive pay, there are also concerns about taxation and dividends, what returns are, and indeed whether they represent good sources of jobs. So I think, what have we got to do about that? I think for public listed utilities, we've got to be better at developing partnerships with people. We've got to be better at operating those assets. I think we've got to stand for good conduct as well. It's very important to us that we're a living wage employer, that we pay fair taxes, and that we create good sustainable jobs for people. And those are all ways in which public companies can compete with this wall of private money that is out there at the moment. And I think we would also call for greater standards and transparency in that sector, and also possibly public service obligations as well. I think they're all matters that have been discussed at the moment and all are sensible. The next point I move on to is around competition and what consequences that can have for systems. So we've had the auctions, we've seen that. I think auctions are here to stay, particularly in generation. That competition is deep, and I think, as I've said, it has yielded benefits. But there can be issues there. The winner's curse that we all know about in auctions. This can lead to issues where maybe projects fail. People sharpen their pencil a little bit too much, and then suddenly there isn't the delivery. And the issue is that if we need critical infrastructure and that delivery isn't there, or those projects do fail, then that can lead to significant issues. And certainly we've noted that out of the first set of auctions that we've seen, for the capacity market in the UK, we've obviously not got a successful CCGT. There has been one, but that obviously didn't actually get built. And so I think for all of us, I think to misquote Kipling a little bit, keeping your head when all those around you are losing theirs is actually quite important. I think good companies that are well run will not be bad winners, and that's important to note. And I think governments have to be aware of the major pitfalls if capacity is relied upon and then doesn't actually arrive because the projects that are underlying it are not as well thought out and well thought through as they should be. So moving on then, I think more into the network space, local balancing is essential as we look at local systems and decentralisation and democratisation, as some people may say, indeed the speaker after me may talk about. I think networks need to look at how they facilitate effectively for generation of all size to come on and balance the system. We've got greater intermittency potentially on some renewables. Clearly offshore, big offshore has got high load factors, but if you've got community projects that we want to see and support, there'll be more intermittency onshore, much lower load factors there. And I think we've probably seen some slowness in the continent and in the UK in order to take this up. So what do we need to do? I think as an industry, we need to embrace that. We need to embrace that transition, as people call it, from a DNO to a DSO to a more of a regional or local system operator. We've certainly done a lot of work on that. We've got significant investments from Ofgem as well, the NIC funding for the transition to DSO. They've been very forward thinking on that. As we move towards RIIO-2, I think both Ofgem and government can make an important contribution to making sure that all of that local generation, that local demand management can happen. And I think it's incumbent on the networks to embrace that change, to look at what investments they can make to make that happen. They must be neutral facilitators. They are natural monopolies and they must be neutral to the technologies that are there, but look to minimise costs to the end user consumers, but allow generators who've got innovative projects to come on board and make that happen. And the networks have a key role to play because they've got the local knowledge, they've got the local infrastructure. It's just adding a little bit of intelligence to all that and possibly some reinforcement. But the key is not to have lots of reinforcement, to make sure that we find and do this in a cost-effective way. The fourth point I'll come back to is technology. So although you've got walls of money, although you've got auctions, technology is a really important driver going forward. As we've seen, renewables have really arrived. A few years ago, we could only dream of sub £100 or €100 a megawatt hour for offshore wind. We're clearly well below that now in recent auctions and even subsidy-free, as has been talked about. I think John at the start noted the explosion in solar. It may not be the best thing. We're based up in Scotland and Magnus is obviously based in Sweden. It may not be exploding in some of those places, but there is a big explosion in solar across the planet. Whatever the renewables are, and I think this is important, or wherever we see these new technologies, we must embrace them. And so while solar may not be as prevalent in some of the countries we come from, clearly wind is, and that's why we make it work there. And batteries too, I think we'll see more and more development of batteries, and obviously the big project in Australia that cost the politician his job was obviously an interesting one I hadn't seen. But what can we do about that? I think utilities can be mischaracterised as not being supportive of renewables, but as we've heard from Magnus, Vattenfall are investing heavily in that area. We're certainly a leader in wind and hydro within the UK. We're the largest renewable generator across the UK and Ireland. So I think utilities should be given the opportunity to deploy technologies, and I think it's the right technologies for the right countries, as we've already discussed. And I think it's incumbent on government and regulators to establish neutral frameworks which allow people to invest in the different technologies. We don't want to really pick winners. I think in the UK, you've probably seen CCGTs being disadvantaged at times. At the moment, you've certainly got reciprocating engines being very encouraged by the construction of the capacity market mechanism, and government may, in the end, need to look at that. I'd also like to see onshore wind coming back into the UK as Magnus pointed out, onshore, in his view in Sweden, is clearly cheaper than offshore. And therefore, where there are community developments which are supported by local people, onshore should be given a chance. And I think this is particularly true because big offshore developments require huge amounts of capital. We can get communities, local authorities much more involved in onshore wind developments. They're far cheaper and smaller in scale, basically. So that's something that we should be looking to do. And then finally, for the 5 points, I would talk about putting the public interest first. I think energy is an essential service. You know, we don't do many, or I don't do many conferences, and then they'll come along together. I've got another one tomorrow, so that's 2 in 2 days. And I'll speak more tomorrow at a conference I'm at about the theme of legitimacy. And at SSE, we've always known that we exist because of an act of Parliament, that we require public consent, and it's a privilege and a responsibility to be able to have the assets that we have and to provide the public service that we do, even though we do so, obviously, from ownership in the public sector. And I think we've seen in some countries, Great Britain included, there is a debate about whether utilities are doing the right things and acting in the public interest. And that, I think, is an absolutely fair debate. I think we have to take this debate absolutely head on. We have to prove that we're an efficient, good operator of the assets that we have and that we're entrusted to have in order to provide a key public service. And we must be putting the public service first every day whenever we get up and whenever we look after customers. For us, that means things like paying fair wages, paying living wages rather than minimum wages. It's about paying fair tax. It's about creating good communities, and it's about creating good jobs as well. And those are all things that we think we should focus on. I'm sure there will be others as well. And I think as we contemplate new ways of demonstrating that we're fulfilling our part of the social contract, there'll be a lot of debate about what that means, but we're certainly out there listening. And utilities must go with the grain of what society and particularly government wants when they're looking to do things. So I think in summary, and I think it builds on what Magnus has said, that there are a couple of big themes here. One is renewables and the advance of renewables, and the other one is decarbonisation, and particularly the decarbonisation of transport and heat. And I think the 5 points that I would make is that we've got to harness investment properly, that we've got to use competition effectively for delivery, we've got to play the right role in bringing innovation and local neutral facilitation into all that, and it's absolutely clear that we've got to act in the public good. Thank you.